everyone, and welcome back. Today is going to be all about the super curvy silhouette of menswear in the 19-teens, but I'm going to have to make a jacket to better understand how exactly they achieved that. And since someone is in my usual spot, let's go ahead, go upstairs to the studio and get started. I have long been fascinated with this era in fashion because the silhouettes are changing so dramatically. For womenswear, we go from the extreme hourglass frilly silhouette of the mid-19-teens to the absolutely straight rectangle that is the mid-1920s. Menswear goes from a really straight rectangle in the 1900s to the inverted triangle in the 1930s that never really leaves us. It's a strange moment in history where things are changing and the ideal silhouettes get caught up in that. The problem, however, is that it doesn't last for terribly long. It peaks right around 1918, but it really only lasts for menswear from about 1916 to 1922. So there's not a lot of surviving garments from that very small window of time, especially since it was such a fashionable style. So the extreme version of it wasn't worn by most men. This is very much in the high fashion range. Yes, the curves do trickle down, and you can see in pictures like this one where we see a range of different ages of very typical men, and you can see some of them, the younger ones, have a lot more curves than the older men in the photo, and that's to be expected. There's always going to be a range. But that's what makes it really complicated and really fascinating for us, because I've always wanted to see just how curvy these garments actually were. What was the extreme fashion of the time? Do all of these illustrations actually do it justice, or were they greatly exaggerated? And the only way for me to find that out, outside of finding a bunch of antiques from the era, which I just can't, I've been looking for years, they're really hard to find, is to reproduce it myself. So I'm going to be looking at drafting manuals for tailors around the time, taking a look at the different styles and trends that they had going on, the different shapes, build a tuxedo based off of those, and come in with construction techniques that I know based on antiques in my collection on either side of it and instructions from right around that 1920 point. So in the end, I can understand just how curvy these things actually were. But it all starts with the drafting manuals. There are fortunately a ton of these online that are free and available. I have my own antique book from around this time as well, but I'm going to combine a few of them together. So yes, there are patterns for tuxedos, not all of them are the shape that I want. I want a shawl collar, not a peaked one, and it's unlikely that I'm going to find exactly the tuxedo style and shape and fit that I'm looking for. Instead, what I can do is take a look at the lapel and collar styles of the tuxedos that I do like, and then find a coat body that is a little bit more on the trendy side and use that to sort of smush the two together. And this one from 1918 is exactly what I am looking for. It is not actually that different from the others, however. There is an extra tiny little dart, but to be honest, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be really super curvy. For example, the antique tuxedo behind me here is from 1929. It is not terribly curvy, but it actually has 3 darts on each side. Just also doesn't have a lot of curve in the side seam, and I think the darts are a little bit of a different shape. But it is a fairly blocky fit, regardless of the darts, so that's not the only thing that has to be happening here. But by combining these, I can get what I want, which is a reflection of what these tailoring manuals were intended for to begin with. They weren't meant to be sewing patterns for a home sewer. They were meant to go out to professional tailors who already had years of training and understanding of how to draft based off of someone's measurements, and they essentially were able to look at these and see what the subtle changes were in order to keep up with the latest fashions. Some of these people that came up with these books and drafting styles would reissue the books every 3 or 4 years, so that way there were new styles, new adjustments, and so what's in these manuals is a great assortment of everything from the most trendy to the most conservative and mundane. And because there are so many subtle changes from one catalog to the next, we can start to track the changes that were occurring in fashion during this time. Menswear is notoriously difficult to track in terms of its changes. There's this notion that it really hasn't changed in 100 or 150 years, but it has dramatically. It just isn't noticeable when you only have a few sparse suits to compare to each other, and they're all custom fit to very different bodies. So instead, we can go back and look at these drafting manuals to see the slight differences that make up a really big change. But It's like reading a whole nother language. Unless you know what you're looking at, these drawings don't look terribly different, and they don't give you much information. Honestly, though, it's what's inside of the suit that is going to give me the actual shaping that I need. It's not just this pattern, it's not just the exterior fabric, it's all of the interior layers and structures. It's amazing how important all of the things that you don't see are to the support that you need, which is one of the reasons why I'm so happy that the sponsor for today's video is Birch. Thanks Birch Living for sponsoring today's video. You may not be able to control what the day throws at you, but you can handle it better with a good night's sleep. That's why I'm so happy to introduce Birch. They make mattresses and sleep products that are stylish, comfortable, and environmentally conscious. It seems like nearly everyone is dealing with the heat wave this year already, and it's only July. I always say the best thing you can do is focus on natural fibers that breathe well and keep you cool. Thankfully, Birch mattresses are crafted with organic and natural materials like wool and cotton that allow for good circulation. They've also been sustainably sourced and are free from polyurethane foams and fiberglass, so no off-gassing or irritants. I've been sleeping on my Birch Luxe mattress for about 2 years now, and it has made such a difference. That's why I'm so excited that I got to add one to my guest room too. I can honestly say that with my Birch mattress, I sleep through the night and I wake up without sore muscles and joint pain. In fact, 93% of recent customers would recommend Birch to a friend, and 87% saw an improvement in their sleep quality. And you don't have to worry about trying it out. With your Birch mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. That means you'll get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. The best part about all of this is Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. They also offer in-home setup and removal to make your buying experience as convenient as possible. Each Birch mattress comes with 2 of their Eco-Rest pillows made from recycled materials. They're breathable and better for the environment. I love my Birch mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch Living. It's the perfect time to upgrade your sleep. Visit birchliving.com/Nicole Rudolph to get 20% off of a Birch mattress plus 2 free Eco-Rest pillows. Thanks again to Birch for sponsoring this week's video and again showing us just how important all of that internal structure actually is. What I need to do is spend a lot of time making up versions of these patterns in order to see the slight changes, actually get a chance to see the full thing fitted out with canvas and padding and pad stitching and all sorts of extra effort that's put into shaping these garments to the body to get it to its ideal, because they actually put a lot of effort into reshaping the body for menswear. But it's impossible to see that just from these tiny little line drawings. And that's what makes projects like this so necessary and so exciting. Though it is not a typical part of tailoring to make a mock-up, in reality, tailors do this professionally. They are making very similar coats over and over and over again. They have their skills down pat. For me, working in completely different eras with very random aesthetics and completely different construction techniques and everything, I still don't quite trust myself enough to just cut right into the fabric. So I made a mock-up first, really just generic muslin one, no details. It more so than anything allows me to get all of the details figured out. I know that the front line and the curve around towards the hem is going to have to change a little bit. Where the pocket placement is going to be needs to shift around. I'm not doing it like the original patterns call for, just generally making sure that the collar fits, the neck's big enough, the shoulders are big enough, all that stuff, but more so than anything, making sure that I have the stylings correct. And it's pretty close. Not a ton of adjustments on the muslin mock-up, and unfortunately not much that we can see from the curves on this. It's really not going to give me the idea of the overall shape just yet. I'm definitely not going to try and make any major adjustments at this point to amplify that, because that's not keeping true with the actual essence of the era. But now that I have pocket placement and all of that figured out, I can start laying things down onto the actual fabric. The main fabric isn't the most important part of getting the right shape, but it can make the work so much harder. I went with a silk and wool mix fabric that has a satin weave on the one side, so it's very shiny, but can also shape and mold well because of the wool. Modern suits are usually made out of an extremely thin wool or wool blend, usually with polyester or other synthetics, which is meant to give the feeling of being lightweight and breathable. Whether it actually is a bit more debatable, but what I can say is that you end up with a very loose and flowy suit. Great for a pair of wide leg trousers, maybe less so for a jacket that's meant to have shape and structure and not crumple to the will of the body right away. I actually have a large swatch set of vintage suitings, and they are dense and structured by comparison to most modern options. And without building up extra layers on the inside, it would be impossible to get the shapeless style I'm going for with something like a modern superfine or tropical wool. I am going to torture myself slightly, however, as I'm going with a silk velvet for the lapels and other details. It's another modern change to a very old fabric that makes this so difficult. Older velvets were worked in heavier backing, so they were stable. Modern silk velvet is actually a very loose silk backing with rayon piles sticking up. Still shiny, but changes shapes, even if you just look at it wrong. Before I can get into all of the infrastructure, the shell needs to be completed, and that means pockets. Granted, these also have a bit of structure so they don't end up sagging, but they don't directly contribute to the final silhouette in that way, at least. They do make a big difference in the proportions, however. I was going through so many different variations on jackets, tuxedos in particular, and they had everything from patch pockets to rectangular flaps to angled welted styles and everything in between. Since a lot of the magazines at this time reuse the same silhouette over and over with different details, we can really see how that changes the feeling of the jacket. In the end, the slanted narrow welt seemed to amplify the swooping curves of the body more than anything else. As long as this pattern ends up working well, I'll probably be making up a few similar jackets based on it in the future. Just changing up the pockets and the lapels for variety. It will be interesting to see just how much of that can alter the silhouette and the balance. This linen canvas is the base for all of the shaping to come. Today we use very light fusibles, but they would have relied on various layers of stiffened linen, padding, and sometimes even horsehair. It doesn't cover the whole body, just the chest and shoulder areas, where all of the movement and crumpling would happen, essentially. Also where a little bit of padding can be added to get the perfect body. The layering I'm doing this time is a combination of my 1890s tailcoat, the 1929 tuxedo, and a tailoring manual from around 1920. Essentially, the one large layer of canvas with a lighter canvas just over the chest. Only the later tuxedo has horsehair, and it's the gauziest fabric I have ever seen inside of a tailored piece. Nothing like the modern stuff that I'm used to using. But because there's two layers to essentially quilt together, there can still be a little bit of shaping. There's also only a single dart in the canvas because the other body dart is right at the edge. That should still give it enough shape. I'm choosing to do the pad stitching here by machine, exactly like my 1890s tailcoat. Though we think of tailoring as involving a lot of really complex hand sewing, they used shortcuts wherever they could as well. Today we usually just glue everything together for mass production, so it's honestly still a step up. While tuxedos weren't exactly the sort of suit that could be purchased ready-made in the 19-teens, most informal styles were. In fact, business and plain suits were some of the first ready-to-wear clothing, after basic unfitted things like shirts and underwear. Tailors advertise catalogs of standard styles to be ordered through the mail with only a few measurements needed by the 1870s, around 20 years before Sears would start selling clothing through their famous catalog. But work like I'm doing and formal options like tuxedos would still commonly be custom made well into the 20th century. The extra work to shape it to the customer was best done with the actual body being in person. I'm adding a little bit of batting at the upper chest to fill out the hollow that I have, for example. It'll overlap a bit with the batting that wraps around the armhole to fill out the hourglass shape and both reinforce and smooth the transition from the body to the sleeve. There's also a shoulder pad, but it's going to be severely cut down from this modern pre-made one. Not because I have small shoulders, but because it's just not the trend of the time to have really wide square shoulders. The padding there is to smooth the area and again offer a nice transition to the sleeve. Looking again at the renderings, they have very sloped shoulders and very narrow. The last layer on the canvas is a felt or other soft fabric meant to smooth over the pad stitching that will happen for the lapel next. It's less important with the velvet that I'm using, but a light wool or a silk would show the indentations of the stitches, especially after pressing. Both the collar and the lapels will have the canvas pad stitched down to the fabric to force it to curve and lay correctly. It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I have 2 fronts ready to go, which means that I need to put them into the actual jacket, which also means that I did a few more seams. It's really all it is, just side seams and shoulder seams. So it is together. It generally fits. I'll find out exactly how well it fits once I get the canvas inside of it and try it back on again, especially with shoulder pads. Things can be a little weird there. I also know that I need to clip some of these seams because they are so curvy. We have a shell, we have canvas, ready to put them together. When laying the canvas into the body, it's essential to account for the curves again. I find it really helps to put a tailor's ham or even a small pillow under the chest and work to baste it in from the exterior. Regardless of the silhouette, there's so many curves in the chest and shoulder area to work around. The under collars and canvas are even cut on the bias, the diagonal, in order to allow for a little bit more stretch and curve. I have seen some collars done by machine, but I've found that they don't have quite the same give as hand sewn. This is also the point where I start transitioning to a lot more hand sewing in general for just that reason. While machine is faster, it's very rigid, it doesn't stretch at all, and jackets like this are sort of like building high-rises. Sure, you can build up rigid shapes and structured curves, but there's joins and areas that need to be able to flex to deal with movement. It's a constant balance between the two extremes. Pad stitching does a great job of holding the curve so the lapel doesn't want to curl up at the edges, but for example, it won't prevent long-term stretching, especially where there's a lot of movement. The outer edges and the roll line, especially where the collar and lapel fold back, will both need some extra help. One of the most common issues in any V-shaped neckline, especially those with lapels, is the gaping that can occur above the chest. While patterning the right shoulder angle fixes most of that, the line is technically on that stretchy bias. So a little bit of rigid tailor's tape holds all of these lines, maybe even shrinks them just a little bit in the right places. It's so fascinating that women's wear historically gets so much disdain for how the body is reshaped and padded to achieve the ideal silhouette, but menswear honestly has just as much effort. every little gap and hollow gets filled out with wool or cotton wadding. Everything inside is basically quilted together to force a shape, sometimes literally quilted together. Don't even get me started on the shoulders. Some eras have nearly an inch of padding on top of the shoulder jutting out way beyond the natural body. The 19 teens is fairly subtle, but they're still adding a little bit. I know the current joke going around is eyebrow blindness, but we really do have shoulder blindness by this point as well. The craziest thing is that by the end of all of these layers and all of the stitching, the coat will basically be able to hold its own shape. But when I put it on, I won't look absurdly altered. All of the structure is hidden away, smoothed over, tucked inside of the jacket with a lining to finish it off. Not even the wearer will see what's inside. The seams are not only there to actually shape the garment, but the lines are in just the right place to make the shoulders look bigger or smaller, sloped or squared. The size of the lapel, the placement of the pockets, it's all to add up to a very complex illusion. And I think that's why tailoring feels so incredibly complex. It's not obvious rows of ruffles or bustles or even false deceivers shoved down the front of a corset. It's hundreds of tiny steps and stitches hidden away that should never be noticed. If the tailor did their job right, no one will think twice about it. It's also why we think menswear is boring and unchanged for decades. And for that matter, why our modern mass production system based on 1 or 2 measurements doesn't produce suits like this anymore. We're stuck with the big shoulder loose body for decades because it's the easiest to fit into. All you have to do is fit the shoulders and hopefully it's just big enough for the body to be inside of. It doesn't actually fit anyone. Curvy options like this are only found in custom work anymore, which is why this era is all the more impressive, because so many suits were mass-produced by this point, and yet this silhouette was popular enough to make it out there and be worth the extra effort. I tried looking for any literature written about the men's silhouette of this time by tailors or anyone else. The most I could find were a few minor asides about how the tapered waist made the shoulders look more pronounced. It wasn't seen as more feminine to have these curves, apparently. I mean, if it had been, you know someone would have been writing about that nonstop. The masculine fashion styles for women during this era were constantly a subject of literary ire. Then again, it's just after World War I. Calling the young men who came back from years in the trenches girly for their suit styles might not have gone over well in a PR sense. But it's a fascinating glance at how fluid the idea of masculinity actually is throughout history. We've only been trapped in the inverted V, must have giant shoulders and no hips thing for decades because it's the easiest to mass produce, which in turn has led us to believe that there's only one ideal for the masculine body, when in reality there are so many variations on it, both in modern bodies and throughout history. We've just kind of forgotten the possibilities that could be there. And if you're really interested in a more in-depth instructional of what I did and a look at the final pattern for what I ended up with, head on over to my Patreon because I'll be posting that to the extra content level this week as well. final talking points. I am really impressed at how curvy this is without feeling feminine in the modern way, where we're used to having certain curves in women's garments that allow for the more feminine body shapes to come through, but it doesn't read that way. The waist is a fair bit higher than that would be set. The chest feels very broad. It's not feeling very like forward. There's a little bit because it has to in order to fit me, but it doesn't feel like that's the main point. The whole thing still slopes in all the right places, and I've tried standing in more like masculine positions and it's very comfortable for that. The only thing that I would do to change shape-wise the next time I do something, there's a little bit of a hollow right here on me, and it wouldn't necessarily be as obvious in other fabrics, but because this fabric shows every single wrinkle and mistake, I think I would add a little bit of wadding right in this area in order to fill that out and make sure that it's not puckering right there, which I think would accentuate all of that. That's the only change that I think I would make in the future. I'm impressed. I love the shape. It feels very accommodating and natural. I don't feel restricted, but it definitely doesn't feel curvy in a modern feminine way.